According to Jesus, you heard the words at the end of that gospel reading. According to Jesus, by your endurance, whatever that means, you will gain your psyche. I have to use the Greek word there because we're not exactly sure. We've got to do some exploring to figure out what we're talking about here. By your endurance, you will gain your psyche. By your endurance, you will gain whatever it is that makes you you. I think that's what that Greek word means, that word psyche. Whatever it is that makes you you. Whatever it is that makes you alive. Whatever it is that makes you real. Whatever it is that gives you soul in the artistic, musical, passionate dance sense of the word. Seems like, as we heard this text from Jesus, that Jesus thinks it's possible to grow a soul during tough times. Jesus apparently thinks that tough times don't necessarily destroy us. Whatever it is that makes us us, in the best sense of the word, these terrible times, these disastrous times, don't destroy whatever it is that makes us us. Apparently Jesus thinks that when the whole culture around us is trying to knock us down and strip us bare, this might be the perfect time for gaining the very thing the world wants to take away from us. Let me stick a couple of caveats in here. First thing about that gospel reading is this. Don't try to read it as a script for the future. The people who first heard those words, the people who first read those words, as Luke wrote them, they knew that Luke was talking about their own experience, the trials and the tribulations that Jerusalem had already experienced during that time between the resurrection of Jesus in roughly 30 AD until the time when Jerusalem was destroyed in roughly 70 AD. The day that Jesus spoke about had already arrived for them. They had already lived through those hellish events, the hellish events of AD 70, when the Roman army got finally fed up with the Jewish unwillingness to submit to Roman rule. They surrounded the city of Jerusalem in a barricade, and they literally starved the city to death. And then when they came in, they destroyed everything. They came to that beautiful temple that was being talked about in the text, and desecrated it in all kinds of vile ways, and then literally tore it to bits so that not one stone was left upon another. All of this had already happened. The readers had already experienced it. They already knew that Luke was talking about their own experience. And so he writes to strengthen this beleaguered minority who lived still under the thumb of the Roman Empire. He's writing to help them figure out how best to endure their predicament. Because these Christians really were in a precarious spot. Once upon a time, they sort of lived under the umbrella of protection that the Jewish religious people like the Pharisees had established. But as the things got tense and as the tension between the two groups got stronger, that large group whose life was put together by the synagogue and by the Pharisees rejected this little tiny group of Christians and persecuted them and punished them with a religious kind of persecution along with all the political stuff that was going on. We remember the story in the book of Acts where Saul, who later became St. Paul, was sent by the synagogue to Damascus to arrest these people who were following that crazy person called Jesus, bring them in and arrest them and punish them and try to make them recant their faith. This is the dynamic that the Christian community lived under. They already knew that what Luke was talking about here, what Jesus was talking about here, was already their experience. And so by extension then, when we read these words, we understand Luke speaking to Christians everywhere who endure trial, Christians everywhere who endure tribulation, no matter where they are. And it's always the case with texts like these. Creating the timetable is not the point. Instead, daring to believe that God still runs the world is the point. Daring to embrace the hope that God will get us through is the point. Daring to behave as though our deeds and our words can somehow bear witness to something beyond the present despair, that's the point. And very often in the history of the church, the Christian community has had to live that point. As we were just now talking, when things got dicey between the followers of Jesus and the synagogue, they had to live this text. When the Roman emperor, as we've already talked, Nero, discovered that the followers of Jesus made very, very convenient scapegoats, he could blame them for whatever kind of nastiness he wanted to do, and a whole bunch of them got crucified just because they were Christians, scapegoats. They dared to believe that God still ran the world. They dared to embrace the hope that God would somehow get them through. They dared to behave as though their deeds and their words somehow mattered. And what about those Anabaptists? You remember their story in the 1600s in Germany and in Switzerland and in Austria? Those people who, as the Lutheran Reformation and the Calvinist Reformation became mainstream, these were the people who began to believe like the modern-day Amish people, the modern-day Mennonites. I grew up around those people, so I know something about their history. But back in the 1600s, when the Lutheran Church and the Calvinist Church was the politically correct group, those Anabaptists endured unbelievable persecution, unbelievable kinds of terrible things to try to make them abandon their faith. And in their own writings, I've read some of their writings, they talk about this text, this gospel reading that we just heard, and understood that then and there they were living through precisely what Jesus was talking about. Our own civil rights workers, when they took to the streets in the 1960s, the Hobby Lobby president, you've heard some of his conversation. He tries to opt his company out of the Affordable Care Act provisions, points to this text. The Roman Catholic Church and a variety of others, when they feel oppressed by the gay marriage kinds of processes and so on, they point to this text and believe that right now they are living this text. And some of our own denominational leaders and some of our own seminary leaders, when they have been arrested for picketing about this cause or that cause, maybe you remember the pictures a few years back of former General Minister John Thomas being arrested in front of the White House. Our own leaders, when they have faced arrest or whatever because of their picketing, they turn to this very text and say that right then and there they are enacting this text. Maybe so, maybe so. In every case, all of these saw their predicaments as just another unfolding of this text. It has nothing to do with predicting the future. It has instead everything to do with discovering how Jesus is present in this time and in this place to help us be faithful. And it has everything to do with realizing that there never is a time when Christians can be lazy. There never is a time when Christians can be sloppy. There never is a time when Christians can be unfocused. And obviously that gets us to another word, that word endurance. At one level, the word means exactly what we think it means. You look it up in the dictionary, you read the definition. It means, even in this text, to some extent, what we always think it means. Endurance is the ability to withstand hardship. Endurance is the ability to sustain a prolonged and stressful effort, like when you're running a marathon or something like that. Endurance has to do with persistence. Endurance has to do with a certain kind of patience. Endurance has to do with a certain kind of perspective, keeping your eye on the goal, no matter what else happens around you, keeping your eye on the goal. It has to do with toughness, physical toughness, emotional toughness. When all sorts of terrifying things are happening, when all sorts of pressures are impinging on us, endurance refuses to give in. And that's part of the point. But the people who research these kinds of things see something more in the way this word is used in the biblical text. They look at the way words take on special kinds of meanings when they are incorporated in a particular setting, like this conversation that Jesus is having. They see that the word endurance in these kinds of settings is not motivated by public opinion. It's not shaped by whatever happens to be politically correct at the moment. Back again to the civil rights thing in the 1960s. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and the rest of the freedom marchers at that point in time were profoundly incorrect politically. The powerful people, the people who run the world, determine what's politically correct. And Martin Luther King Jr. and the others at that moment in time were profoundly incorrect politically. And the politically powerful tried to intimidate them. You know the story, you've read it and heard it and maybe even watched it unfold. They were arrested, they bombed their churches, they turned the fire hoses on their marches, they lynched and beat and butchered some of them. And then because of the religious orientation that some of them had, some of the pastors who were also playing along with the powerful people tried to persuade these civil rights workers that they needed to be patient. You know what they meant by patient? Just be patient a little longer. Be patient a little longer. Be patient a little longer. Be patient for another 10 years. Be patient for another 20 years. Be patient for another 50 years. And after a while, absolutely nothing gets done. That's the kind of patience they were counseling. And none of it worked. None of it stopped them. Their endurance was not motivated by public opinion. Their endurance was not motivated by any of those external factors. You couldn't reward them with anything that would stop them. You couldn't punish them with anything that could stop them. Because, according to their own witness, they believed that the words of Jesus had taken shape in their souls. They believed that those words from Jesus would define their words. Those words from Jesus would define their action. They also believed, like we were reading from the prophet Isaiah, about a new heaven and a new earth. That vision, you remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech about having a dream that comes right out of the prophets, a dream that was so firmly embedded in their souls that they would not stop until it became real, step by step and bit by bit and little by little for as long as it takes. And that's endurance. Against a hostile world, the endurance is waiting confidently for God to act. Against a hostile world, endurance is standing firm, persevering, staying on course. Even if it seems like we don't accomplish much of anything, at least not so far as anybody can see. Even if the persevering costs you your life. But endurance knows something. Endurance knows something that nobody else knows. Endurance knows that that little bit that I do and that little bit that you do, somehow or other, God comes along and gathers up all those little bits and pieces of things and then adds them all together and then adds to it the stuff that only God can add. And suddenly the world begins to change. Endurance dares to believe that sooner or later, somewhere along the way, all of those little bits get collected in ways that begin to save the world. And so endurance endures. Endurance endures, and in the process it gains life. Endurance endures, and in the process it gains soul. Endurance endures, and even if it is put to death, it does not perish. Now Jesus said that, I didn't say it. Jesus said that, and Jesus said it was true. And then by his own endurance, Jesus went out and proved it. And that's why Jesus can say to us, listen to me, trust me, follow my example. Know that God is at work for the good of all of God's children, no matter what it looks like at the moment. And that maybe gets us around to this. Maybe one of the ways you get a life, maybe one of the ways that you get a life, especially when life seems very difficult to get, is to figure out what is worth standing up for, and then going out and standing up for it. Let us pray. Almighty God, your sovereign purpose none can make void. Give us faith to be steadfast amid the tumults of this world, knowing that your kingdom will come and your will be done to your eternal glory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.